Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, Canada's most irreverent talk show here. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on True North on this Tuesday, June 25th, 2024. It is a rather momentous day, and momentous for two reasons. Number one, I'm going to admit that I was wrong. I know it never, ever happens. Don't tell my wife I said that, and don't fact check it for the love of all that is holy. But I try to not make predictions, because when I make predictions, you can be wrong. If you don't make a prediction, you can't be wrong. It's actually a great way to do the opposite of that old Wayne Gretzky quote of you'll always miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Well, conversely, you'll never miss a shot that you don't take. But anyway, let me just point out here, I said yesterday that I didn't think the Conservatives were going to win St. Paul's. Toronto St. Paul's, it's the riding in Midtown Toronto that has been in Liberal hands since 1993. It was not a seat that elected a Conservative since 1988. But, well, let's just take a look at the poll numbers from yesterday's by-election. Conservative Don Stewart, 15,555 votes. That is 42.1%. Liberal Leslie Church, 14,965 votes. Not too many behind, but enough. That is 40.5%, meaning that the Conservatives have won Toronto St. Paul's. Now, this is quite something. Let us just put this into a little bit of context here for what this means in Toronto. I like maps. I like geography. Let's put up a political map of Toronto. Yeah, look at that sea of red all the way from Lake Ontario right up to Steeles Ave, and then smack dab in the middle, that little glimmer of blue, that is Don Stewart's riding, the MP-elect for Toronto St. Paul's. If Justin Trudeau's view of economics holds politically, that these things grow from the heart outward, that will not be good for the Conservatives by the time the next election rolls around. But this is where we get into the fascinating discussion of what exactly went wrong for the Liberals and whether you can extrapolate anything from this moving forward. Now, Leslie Church was by all accounts a star Liberal candidate. She was a longtime Liberal staffer, well-liked personally, not from the riding, but from Toronto. She had been Chrystia Freeland's chief of staff up until quite recently. Leslie Church is the Liberal who lost Toronto St. Paul's. Now, I don't want to blame her. I think Justin Trudeau bears a lot more of the blame, to be honest. I think this is just another church that went down in flames on Justin Trudeau's watch. But this is, I think, an interesting dilemma, because the Justin Trudeau brand is so tarnished, is so damaging, that even in one of the Liberal strongholds that the Liberals held in 2011, when Michael Ignatieff got just blown out of the water, they could not win that in a by-election. What's changed? Well, you've got more time with Justin Trudeau at the helm, which has not obviously worked out well for him. You have a new leader who is, in actuality, bringing a fair bit of hope and momentum towards Canadians. Pierre Poilievre is doing well. He is doing well. He is not the scary, evil, conservative boogeyman that the Liberals have tried to make him out to be. Yesterday, the Liberal Party was tweeting nonstop from all its accounts about how Conservatives are going to roll back abortion rights, and they're trying to do this. Again, abortion and assault rifles. These are the two things the Liberals talk about when their backs are up against the wall. But it didn't work. It did not work. Now, I thought this was going to be close. I thought the Conservatives were going to be within 5% of the Liberals. I was correct, although it was on the other end of it. Conservatives were ahead by less than 5 points rather than behind. The Liberals and Conservatives were both downplaying expectations right up until the polls closed and even a little bit after. But the Liberals threw everything they had at this. The Liberals threw everything. They had cabinet ministers knocking on doors. Remember this photo of Ahmed Hassan? He was going there. And do you remember I don't know if we have the close-up, the woman's face when there we go. Evidently, that poor woman who recoiled when a Liberal cabinet minister came to her door was far more representative of the people of Toronto St. Paul's than anyone else. I decided, given the results and what happened yesterday, we had to memorialize that pivotal moment in a key way. And what better, more Canadian way than this? Yes, that is a Canadian Heritage Minute for you there. It is part of our history. So we've had some fun about this. I'm going to continue to have some fun about this. Sheila Copps, interestingly enough, the former Deputy Prime Minister herself, took to Twitter late last night, as she probably shouldn't do, and said, you have to wonder why the Tories, with a 20% lead in the national polls, didn't do better in a riding with a 15% Jewish vote. Maybe the community likes Liberal Party policies. So she thinks that, if all the Jews all the Jews voted Liberal, that's why Conservatives didn't win when they should have. Well, maybe, just maybe, that's not the way it works. For starters, ethnic groups are not a monolith. But if there is a quote-unquote Jewish vote, I think that was a lot more in line with the Conservatives, which is why the Liberals just scrambled to get Anthony Housefather, the pro-Israel, one of the only two pro-Israel MPs in the Liberal caucus, to go down and campaign in St. Paul's, because they were worried, and rightfully so, that a lot of Jews in that riding didn't want to vote Liberal anymore, even though they had for much of, the last, 35 years or so. So what's interesting here, if we look at this, and by the way, this was a by-election. By-elections are always a bit wacky. I think we have a photo of the ballot, and you saw there were on that ballot 84 candidates, because there's this group of people that are trying to protest for electoral reform by just loading up the ballots as independents. And it was that long ballot that was actually one of the reasons the results took so long to count. Elections Canada was counting until 4:44 a.m. this morning. So it was great, because he was in the lead until the last ballots were added. Leslie Church was in the lead until the last ballots were added. So if you were a Liberal that went to bed before 4:30 a.m., you were thinking, great, we won, hallelujah. iPolitics even had declared the Liberals the winner. They just wrote the story, declared the Liberals the winner, and then just went to bed and said, job well done. And then they wake up at, 6 a.m. the next morning and are like, oh, holy crap, we made a little bit of a boo-boo there. But what's happening is you have now this panic of people trying to figure out what this means. Sherry DeNova, who's a former New Democrat in Parkdale High Park, provincially, she had tweeted out that this is a sign the alt-right is taking over, the alt-right. Well, if the alt-right were elected in Toronto St. Paul's, we've got bigger problems here. Maybe, just maybe, your framing of the so-called alt-right is not accurate. That's not how Canadian voters, not how Toronto voters are viewing the Conservative Party of Canada when stacked up against the Liberal Party of Canada under Justin Trudeau. Now, we have not yet heard from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He is set to have a press conference any minute now, and we'll try to get some clips and reaction from that as it comes in. We did have Chrystia Freeland speaking just moments ago to reporters in Toronto. She was making an announcement about something to do with rural Ontario municipalities, but of course, no one had a single question about that announcement. All the questions she took were from reporters about the Toronto St. Paul's by-election. This was the first one from Marika Walsh of the Globe and Mail.
Deputy Prime Minister, can the Prime Minister still stay on to lead the Liberal Party into the next election, given that you just lost one of the safest seats in the entire country last night?
Yes, he certainly can.
Can you explain why? Because everybody we're hearing from behind the scenes believes that the result last night means catastrophic losses across the country. If you cannot win in Toronto under Justin Trudeau, why should anybody believe you can win anywhere else under him?
Our government is focused on working hard for Canada and Canadians and on delivering results for Canada and Canadians. That is what the Prime Minister is focused on. That is what we are all focused on. The Prime Minister is committed to leading us into the next election, and he has our support.
Now, whether Justin Trudeau himself will have a bit more self-awareness than that, I don't know. It's funny, as Chrystia Freeland was singing, I have a very bad taste in music. It's one of my most off-putting qualities. I have a few of them, but my taste in music is one of them. I listen to horrendous 90s adult contemporary music. But as my wife says, if they don't play it in a Winners, you probably don't listen to it. So anyway, so that's my little bias there. But as Freeland was talking, I was hearing Dido in my head. I will go down with this ship. That is basically Chrystia Freeland right now. She is hitching herself so closely to Justin Trudeau's wagon that there is no wiggle room, there is no post-political future for Chrystia Freeland. And by the way, if the Liberals aren't safe in Toronto, St. Paul's, University Rosedale, where Liberal MP Chrystia Freeland is the Liberal MP, sounds redundant, but that's the point of it, is that one's not necessarily safe. I mean, imagine what would happen if all of these ridings that the Torontos have been very cushy and comfy and cozy in are now all of a sudden up for grabs, and they need to devote their campaign resources to just not going down to 4 seats. That's what we're basically looking at right now. I don't know if we have a graphic of it, but David Coletto, who's a pollster, wrote a really interesting analysis on there where he says this is a swing big enough that if you extrapolate it, it could wipe out 55 Liberal seats in Ontario. He said this was a 25-point swing between how the Liberals were in St. Paul's in the last election and how they are now. A 25-point swing. So if that's going to happen here, and you kind of extrapolate that to other so-called safe Liberal seats, this is the Liberals potentially losing 55 seats in Ontario. Now, campaigns are won and lost based on how you deploy your resources in a lot of ways. It's not just about whether you have the best ideas, the best slogan, the best hair. Campaigns are in many ways about where you choose to devote your energy, the phone calls, the canvassers, all of that. So just imagine a campaign in which the Liberals, who right now have 100 and some odd seats, a minority, but enough, have to devote all their resources just to holding on to ridings like St. Paul's, to hold on to Chrystia Freeland's riding, where in an ideal world, the Liberals shouldn't have to spend more than 5 cents to run a campaign. And now all of a sudden they have to spend their money there. They're never going to be able to win seats that the Conservatives have in other parts of the riding. They're never going to be able to hold on to swing ridings. They have to deploy resources just to not get decimated. That's what's basically happening here. And by the way, resources will be a heck of a lot more finite if no Liberals are wanting to show up to the polls. Liberals aren't wanting to put up lawn signs. Liberals aren't wanting to volunteer. They aren't wanting to go knock on doors, which is what we were getting a sense of in the lead up to the St. Paul's by-election. Even people that were just begrudgingly voting Liberal because they are Liberals were not enthusiastic about it. They were not happy about it. They weren't excited about it at all. And again, when you just look at those numbers, and he gets just 500-600 votes more than the Liberal did, compared to the Conservatives being behind by 24% last time, this is catastrophic for Justin Trudeau. Now, Justin Trudeau did put out a statement. He put out a statement today, and in this statement, it makes it sound like he's not going anywhere at all. He says, I want to thank the volunteers and candidates for putting their name forward, participating, including Leslie Church, yada, yada, yada. He congratulates Don Stewart. He says he wants to thank the people of... This line, I think, rings a bit hollow. Most of all, I want to thank the people of Toronto, St. Paul's for exercising your right to vote and making your voice heard. I really don't think he's that grateful to the voters of St. Paul's right now, Justin Trudeau. He says, this was obviously not the result we wanted, but I want to be clear that I hear your concerns and frustrations. These are not easy times, and it is clear I and my entire team have much more hard work to do to deliver tangible, real progress that Canadians can see and feel. We will never stop working. They want you to stop working. Canadians want you to stop working, Prime Minister. That's the reason they voted against your Liberal, because you've been doing stuff. Anyway, we will never stop working and fighting to make sure you have what you need to get through these tough times. My focus is on your successes, and that's where it's going to stay. There is a bit more humility there than there was when Trudeau was asked about polling, well, any time, but even a couple of weeks ago. He was asked about polling, you may remember, on Power and Politics, and this is how he justified being 20 points behind the Conservatives in the polls.
Despite that optimistic picture, I mean, the country is still angry. You can see it in the mood. And increasingly, Prime Minister, a lot of them are mad at you, right? I know you say you want to beat Pierre Poilievre. You keep coming back to that. But what if you are the reason the Liberals can't beat the Conservatives in the next election? Where do you factor that into your thought process?
Well, I think, first of all, Canadians are not in a decision mode right now. What you tell a pollster, if they ever manage to reach you, is very different from the choice Canadians end up making in an election campaign. And fundamentally, and it's not just Canada, but everywhere around the world, and indeed I was talking with other leaders at the G7 and in Switzerland at the Peace Conference for Ukraine, everywhere people are struggling with high inflation, with cost of living issues, with interest rates, with housing challenges, with childcare challenges, all these things. We are doing better than many countries. Doesn't make a difference to someone who can't pay for their groceries, but the way people are everywhere facing a certain amount of frustration. And I truly believe that as we choose to step up on solving those challenges, to contrast with a political vision that so far consists from the Conservatives of just making people more angry and saying everything is broken, I know Canadians are pragmatic people who focus on solutions, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing.
Canadians were not in decision mode, believe it or not. Well, maybe Canadians aren't in decision mode when they're talking to Abacus or Ipsos or Angus Reid or anything like that, but Canadians, at least those in Toronto, St. Paul's, were very much in decision mode yesterday. And the decision they made in a riding that, again, has been Liberal since 1993, has elected Liberals for years, that in that riding of all ridings, they made a decision, and the decision was, we don't want anything to do with Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. Now, again, there's always a risk in by-elections of trying to read too much into them. They are inherently wacky events, and the reason they are wacky events is because you don't tend to have the civic duty driving people to vote like you do in general elections, which is why turnout is always down. You also have these things that in some ways are weird microcosms of the national picture, just by virtue of when they take place. But in other ways, by-elections are odd because the candidates are often not necessarily local. The teams running it are not necessarily local. So you have like national talent, national attention that's all converging in this one little place. Now, in this particular riding, because you have such a large Jewish population, there is the sense that the Israel-Gaza war, the Israel-Hamas war particularly, was probably feeding into it. I mean, I saw there was this TikTok influencer, Rachel Gilmore, who had tweeted earlier about how basically the Liberals lost because in part they were too pro-Israel. They weren't condemning the quote-unquote Israeli genocide enough. And, you know, the reality that anyone thinks you could win in St. Paul's by just like knocking on doors and telling the kind Jews in Forest Hill, I think you're complicit in genocide. That is basically the argument you're hearing from a lot of anti-Israel activists here. And if Israel was a driving force in the vote at all, which I think it probably was to some extent, it was the Liberals being punished for not being sympathetic enough to Israel, not being pro-Israel enough. And there was a third-party group led by Andrew Kirsch, who's been on the show in the past, actually, a former CSIS intelligence officer, and Stephen Taylor, who's not been on the show, but I've known him for many years. They had a third-party group called Jewish Ally, and they were running very targeted, specific ads in this riding, in this by-election, as you're allowed to do under Elections Canada rules. And they were really targeting Jewish votes by saying, hey, if you want the Jewish Ally, you got to vote Conservative. That's a crude distillation of the message. I'm hoping to chat with either Stephen or Andrew about that campaign tomorrow, because I think it's a very interesting one if you look at how diaspora politics are influencing elections. But let's not take away from the main point here, and I think the bigger picture of this, which is that right now, the polling numbers, which people have seen that a lot of Liberals have tried to dismiss, are no longer dismissible. They're just simply not dismissible. These are not things that people can avoid. And Justin Trudeau himself, who in the past has, I've maintained, had a relatively ironclad grip on his caucus, is probably going to be facing calls for his head that are a lot more explicit than they have been. The Liberals are very fortunate that they don't have to go into a caucus meeting tomorrow morning because the House of Commons has risen for the summer, because quite frankly, if the Liberals were doing what is what they should be doing, they would be having activated the Reform Act provisions that Michael Chong's law gives them so that they could vote him out themselves, give him the old Aaron O'Toole heave-ho out the door, because right now he has not shown the level of self-awareness that you would expect from someone in that category. Now, we'll be talking about this in a few moments with Paul Wells. There is this idea that you cannot count Justin Trudeau out, that he has beaten the odds time and time again. This was the thrust behind Paul Wells' most recent book, Justin Trudeau on the Ropes, Governing in troubled times. And he really likens things back to Justin Trudeau in that boxing match some years ago against Patrick Brazeau. And everyone thought Patrick Brazeau was just going to mop the floor with Trudeau. He won the first round, but the next 2 rounds, Justin Trudeau came back and ended up emerging victorious. You may recall Ezra Levant had to, because he was like, Ezra was the ringside announcer. So Ezra Levant had to like declare Justin Trudeau the winner. I should pull up that photo at some point because it was a fun one. I think that boxing match was like the most widely viewed Sun News episode ever in the history of Sun News Network. But all of that is besides the point here. We right now are in the midst of a moment that I think the next few days will be very revealing on. And if you start to see some Liberal MPs announce they're not running again, I think it's they realize that they are simply not going to have a future. And especially if you're already pension eligible, if you've already served your 6 years, you're not like Jagmeet Singh and you have to wait until February to be eligible for your pension. But if you're one of those Liberal MPs that, again, like, no, my thesis on this, if I want to just put it down to a crude point here, is that there's no such thing as a safe Liberal seat anymore. And that's not to say there's no such thing. Like, obviously, there are ridings that, you know, like Ottawa Centre or whatever, Toronto Centre, these are going to be Liberal ridings. But even if you look at Ontario, there are a lot of these downtown ridings that provincially are NDP. And Sean, I don't know if you can put up the polling numbers again, or the election the results from last night or this morning. But if you look at the NDP, and this is again a Midtown Toronto riding, 10.9% of the vote. So that is a collapse of the NDP. Now, I don't know if Jagmeet Singh like ever so much as went to St. Paul's. Like, the NDP had basically thrown in the towel. And there was in some ways like a strategic voting effort going on there in which the NDP just was a complete non-entity. And imagine if the NDP had stepped it up. If the NDP were there to be a principled, progressive alternative to Justin Trudeau and the Liberals in some of these downtown, midtown, urban Toronto ridings. So that's one thing to look at as well. And I think the utter collapse and really fecklessness of the federal NDP right now is a story that will influence the next election as well. I saw some activists online going on about how they think vote splitting cost the election, that if you can just, take the 11% that the NDP got and add it on to the Liberal vote total, ta-da, the Liberals will win. That was the calculation the Conservative Party of Canada had to go through leading up to the merger of the Alliance and PC parties in 2003. But the problem with that is that the Liberals have historically viewed themselves not as a left-wing party. They viewed themselves as a centrist party. And I think there are a lot of Liberals like, an Anthony Housefather, for example, that would be very uncomfortable with the Liberal Party going even further to the left than it has right now to, bring in people like, Nikki Ashton and, Charlie Angus and those types of folks. So I think in that sense, it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch here. And just to, again, bring this into perspective, this is a riding that in 2011, when Michael Ignatieff was absolutely decimated by the Conservatives, the year that Harper won his infamous majority government, they still held Toronto St. Paul's. So that's what we're dealing with here. And the Liberals, my one and only interview with Justin Trudeau was in 2015. And, even Justin Trudeau, who was trying to rebuild the party at the time, had conceded that, the Liberals just got trounced them. But even in that, Toronto St. Paul's was one of theirs. My colleague at True North, Sue-Ann Levy, she ran in a by-election in St. Paul's provincially. That was, I want to say 2006 or 2007, 2008. It was around there. And again, Sue-Ann, she was very well known through being a writer with the Toronto Sun. It was the provincial PCs, which at the time were going up against Kathleen Wynne, and they're a more moderate party historically. She is Jewish. She is a lesbian. So she was ticking off, as she said in her book, some of these progressive boxes. And even she was not able to break through in Toronto St. Paul's. And at the time, there were people saying, why would you even try? This is always going to be a Liberal riding. So the Liberal Party right now does not have a mechanism to get rid of Justin Trudeau. This is a crucial point. They do not have a mechanism by which caucus members could vote to get rid of him. They don't have a mechanism by which their members could trigger some sort of a referendum or petition. The only way Justin Trudeau is going is if he just wakes up one day and decides he needs to go. If Justin Trudeau wakes up and decides he needs to go, if he just wakes up one day and says, okay, fine, I realize it, I take the hint, you guys don't want me, I'm gone. But nothing about him has shown a willingness to do that. Even if I go back to the statement that he sent this morning, he says, we clearly have much more hard work to do to deliver tangible, real progress that Canadians can see and feel. We will never stop working and fighting to make sure you have what you need to get through these tough times. My focus is on your success, and that's where it's going to stay. They don't like you. They don't want to like you. The issue is not that they know. The issue is not that they don't know you. The issue is not that they don't know what you're doing. The issue is that they know too well and do not want you to keep doing it. So there's an amusing sort of joke to this all, which is that basically the only way to get Justin Trudeau to stop working is by, not voting a Liberal MP. It's very weird. He's just going to, double down and rebuild it. And Chrystia Freeland, I shared with you that one clip or one exchange she had with Marika Walsh. She was asked about it by other reporters, very similar iterations of the same question. And the line that she committed to was, well, we need to rebuild trust. We need to rebuild trust. That's what we need to do. And I was reminded of frankly, her chums at the World Economic Forum. That was their big theme in January, rebuilding trust. And the problem whenever people talk about rebuilding trust is that they aren't actually all that interested in looking inward at what they've done to sow distrust. They always try to come up with other people who can be blamed for this. For example, remember what Chrystia Freeland said yesterday about people who vote Conservative in the by-election. Take a look.
That is Leslie's vision. That's the Liberal vision. That's why I'm really calling on the people of St. Paul's to go out there and vote for her. Because the alternative is really cold and cruel and small. The alternative is cuts and austerity, not believing in ourselves as a country, not believing in our communities and in our neighbors.
If you vote Conservative, you are supporting an option that is, cold, cruel, and small. Cold, cruel, and small. That's what she said about people who vote Conservative. So, again, a little bit of victim blaming there. The voters of St. Paul, they've just voted for this cold, cruel, small alternative. And what was interesting, Linda Frum, the former Conservative senator, she had tweeted this morning, which out of context was an admittedly weird tweet. She said, well, I guess Conservatives are, hang on, let me look up the exact wording because I don't want to get the joke wrong. She posted on social media this morning. She guesses Conservatives are hot, kind, and big. They're not cold, cruel, and small. They're hot, kind, and big. That is what Conservatives are. And I was reading that, and at first it took me a second. I'm like, what is she talking? And then I remembered Chrystia Freeland's thing, and I responded that I'm two of those things. I think I'm kind. I'm definitely big. I don't know about hot. Maybe in the summer. Maybe in the summer I can get to hot as a technicality. But that was Linda Frum's point. So again, it proves that what Chrystia Freeland and a lot of the Liberal media spin folks have been saying over the last month, over the last couple of days in particular, is just not translating to voters. So if Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are relatively immune, if they're relatively immune from the attacks and the smears, what is that going to mean if you extrapolate it to a bigger election, if you extrapolate it to a general election where it's not just Toronto, St. Paul's, but it's the whole country? And I go back to just the electoral math on this and the deploying of resources. If the Liberals are focusing on having to just not lose places such as University Rosedale and Ottawa Centre, if they're focused on that, how on earth are they going to maintain or, heaven forbid, build anywhere else? And if you're a Liberal that's been there, like John McKay, who's a longtime Liberal member of Parliament, he was like the last pro-lifer in the Liberal caucus until Justin Trudeau kind of like bludgeoned the pro-lifeness out of him a little while ago. John McKay, 23 or 27 years. I can't remember how long he's been there, but quite a few. And John McKay just the other day announced he's not going to be seeking re-election. So here's a guy that would rather not have, and he's an MP from Scarborough, if I can't remember which one, I think like Scarborough Southwest or something. something. But he's a guy who, again, would rather not have the sting of defeat on an otherwise very successful political career. So for him, it's a natural point just to get out of there. There are Liberal MPs that were just elected for the first time in 2019 or 2021. And they're kind of in the position now of saying, I haven't really had a chance to do anything, but already I'm about to be shown the door. And this happened to a lot of Conservative MPs in 2011 when Harper won his majority. They were elected in the Greater Toronto area and places such as Aurora and Oshawa. Well, not Oshawa, that's a Conservative riding, but Aurora, Newmarket, and Markham, and Mississauga. And you had all of these one-term MPs that they got in, they served one term, and then they were out the door because Harper couldn't hold on to his government when 2015 came around. So that's where you have, I think, this looking really bad for Liberal members of Parliament. And will they decide once and for all it's time to start calling for Justin Trudeau's political head on a political platter? I don't want anyone to get any ideas about, me suggesting something, untoward. But that's effectively the decision going on here. So look, we can go and talk about, oh, this poll went this way, or maybe this sign did this, or this canvassing did this. But there's a bigger picture here that we should not lose sight of. We'll be talking in a little bit with Rahim Mohamed in the National Post, who has had some, well, he has interesting thoughts on pretty much everything, but definitely some interesting thoughts on this. But I want to welcome in to talk about the psychology of Justin Trudeau on this almost. Paul Wells, because journalist Paul Wells wrote a book that was very fascinating. And we actually share a publisher in Ken White of Sutherland House. And he wrote about this called Justin Trudeau on the Ropes, Governing in Troubled Times. And he joins me now. Paul, it's good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Hi, Andrew. How are you?
I'm doing well. I should just say to hit this, right out of the gate, you had done what I think a lot of people did, which is like you went to bed thinking the Liberals had won, and then you woke up in the morning and had to write a mea culpa on this. And I just get away from that by not making predictions, because then I don't have to be wrong ever, whereas you take the swing. But before you saw the vote yesterday, what did you think was going to happen? Before you saw the numbers come in and kind of concluded it was over?
So I happened to be in the riding. I'm not in Toronto that often, but I happened to be there a couple of weeks ago, and I ran into a bunch of Liberals who were really nervous, and a couple who, reading between the line, were not super interested in voting Liberal. They thought it was time to send Justin Trudeau a message. And I was at a fancy Ottawa garden party just before the returns came in, and I ran into a former senior public servant, now retired, who I believe has voted Liberal in most elections in their life. And they said, I wish I lived in Toronto St. Paul because I would use my vote to send Trudeau a message. And so I knew they were heading for trouble, but they would have to have a lot of trouble before they lost. And so I was open to the very strong possibility that it was going to be tight, but not lost for the Liberals. And that was why I believe the early returns the way I did.
Justin Trudeau has in the past been incredibly dismissive of anything that everyone else kind of uses to say that he's in trouble. I mean, poll numbers are a great example of this. And obviously you should be aware of polls and not give them too much stock. But there was that line he gave to David Cochrane not that long ago about how, Canadians aren't in a decision mode right now. Yeah. And that's why they're saying they'll vote for Poilievre. And then yesterday in Toronto, St. Paul's, they are in decision mode. And he's not really ever shown any overt sense that he gets it. And I'm curious what your take on that is. What would it take for him to really realize, hey, I'm the problem?
So when magazines started publishing photos of him in blackface, he this is now 5 years ago, but he suddenly had to admit that in fact he had worn blackface and that was a mistake. Confronted with absolutely stark evidence. You've been on the air. I don't know if you saw. He sent out a communique less than an hour ago, in which he says, "Okay, I get it. This was bad. This shows that we have work to do." But it's very much classic first draft Trudeau. It's like the statements he made after the SNC Lavalin story broke. He understands our concern and he promises to do better. And I think a lot of people, including some Liberals, are saying, no, we don't need you to do better. We need you to go. And my hunch is that he's not rejecting that. He's processing it and trying to figure out how much maneuvering room he has.
From your knowledge, I mean, they pick up your, I don't know if they pick up your calls still, but I think historically you've had relatively good access to the Liberals, certainly better than I have, because I don't think they've ever thrown you out of an event. But I'm curious, insofar as you've learned from your contacts and sources in Ottawa, did they have a plan for this? Did they have a plan for what does he do if Don Stewart wins?
It's funny. I was chatting with my wife, who's a consultant and conservative and very politically engaged, as I left the house this morning, and I said, I wonder whether they had a contingency plan. It turns out, so Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, had a very bad election 10 days ago in European elections, and he had been discussing the possibility of an electoral route with his closest advisors for a week, and they came out with an audacious plan to call new legislative elections. And it's not at all clear that it will work, but Macron had a what if we have a bad day plan. I don't know whether the Liberals did. I have begun to put that question to Liberals. But if they did, it would be out of character, because they tend to hope for the best, and they corner very badly when things turn out less than the best. I mean, what I expect is several days of confusion during which everything the Prime Minister says can be treated as a curiosity rather than as the final word, because it's going to take them days to figure out what they think and what they want to tell us.
There's been, from the Liberal Party, I mean, really going back to 2015, I'd say a public caucus unity that, the past two Conservative leaders would have killed to have, in the sense that you don't see the knives out for Justin Trudeau in the way that Conservatives have historically for their leaders. And I'm wondering if you think that will change now. Will you start to get Liberals that are speaking up a bit more publicly about their concerns? Or do you think that the same pattern we've seen for the last 9 years will continue to hold there?
So now I know someone who has an appointment with Christy Clark today, a long-standing appointment with Christy Clark, social thing, who says the day just got complicated because Christy Clark's phone is ringing off the hook. I expect you could multiply that by about 7, because I expect Anita Anand's having a complicated day, and Sean Fraser, and I have no idea who's making those calls or what the content of those calls are, but I think that that's kind of happening in a lot of corners. One level of taboo has fallen. There hasn't even been much informal discussion about next time post-Trudeau leadership in the Liberal Party, and it hasn't been enforced by above. It's been consensual. Liberals have not felt that it was proper that a leader who gave them a decade in power, or nearly, is owed some deference on these questions. That's gone. At least privately, they are now talking. The next question is, is there going to be public statements? Will any sitting member of caucus, will any of the half dozen cabinet ministers who left on more or less peaceful terms, people like Navdeep Bains and Mark Garneau, and will they start to say something? And my hunch is they won't, not immediately. But new MPs are dragged up the House of Commons by their own leader and by the Prime Minister. Does Justin Trudeau really want to be the Prime Minister who drags the new MP for Toronto St. Paul's up the center aisle of the House of Commons? Man, he has some decisions to make pretty fast.
Yeah, no, I think you raise a valid point there. And I'm also curious, and again, I never like the armchair psychoanalysis of politicians, but with Justin Trudeau, I do find it fascinating, because there's something that I've suspected, and I'm curious if you agree or not, that he doesn't really care what party he leaves behind, that he's okay if it sort of is a sinking ship and he takes it down. And I'm not convinced that he's as focused on legacy for the party. And I wonder how, if you take that to a context of the next election, if that weighs in, because I do think the party would have a better time rebuilding. They're certainly not going to win the next election at this stage, even if they have an interim leader. But the reality is they would probably set themselves up a little bit better to start having those succession discussions now instead of, the day after the 2025 election. But I'm curious if I'm projecting something on him that you don't necessarily see.
I had a really chilling moment in conversation with a member of Trudeau's caucus, probably 5 or 6 months ago, where I said, I have always thought that Trudeau, the day he leaves will be the day he stops caring about the future of the Liberal Party. And he just decides that he has to make a decision for himself. And this MP said, do you think he has ever cared about the Liberal Party? It was shattered when he came along, and he used it as a vehicle or a kind of a hitching post for a very personal movement, and that there was never a time when concerns about the future of the Liberal Party without Trudeau weighed much in his own career decisions. It's one thing for me to say that, but for me to hear that from somebody who sits and hears from the Prime Minister every week in Liberal caucus meetings was a different moment. And but I do think that the final calculation, the decision to leave, will be based on whether he's done, not on, and there won't be a lot of bandwidth for thinking about what's going to happen to the Liberal Party next.
I thought my thesis was kind of snarky, but it's not even as audacious or as radical as the one you got from a Liberal member of Parliament. Paul Wells, you can catch him on Substack, many other places, but I love his Substack. I'm a paid subscriber. It's at paulwells.substack.com. And if you're there, you should check out my long-form interview with him about my book, Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life, which
Thanks.
All right. That was journalist Paul Wells, longtime political observer, commentator, author. I actually quoted his book about Stephen Harper in my book on Poilievre, because there was a fascinating Poilievre quote about social conservatives in there. Continuing along here, I wanted to bring in Rahim Mohamed. Now, he was one of the early adopters, the early boosters of True North. So we always have a soft spot for him. Now he's doing tremendous work at the National Post and has just secured a fantastic new gig talking about Ottawa's relations with the West for the National Post. Rahim Mohamed, good to talk to you, sir. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Andrew. To be honest, I'm not sure I would have said yes had I known I'd be following Paul Wells on maybe 4 hours of sleep. So
Paul Wells was your warm-up act. Here you go. You're the main event right now.
So even no the best of times.
Where did my camera go? My camera just disappeared.
Yeah. So, but good to see you as always. I don't know where my camera
went. Hopefully we'll get the camera back. And there we go. Okay, I see I'm used to losing the guest video, not my own.
Terrific product placement, by the way. Love.
Yes, thank you very much. You kindly wrote a great review of that book as well when it came out, so I appreciate that.
Had to speed read it over a weekend. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rahim.
Those 200 pages over a weekend. It's good. Well spent.
What is it you were looking for? Because you're coming at this from a different perspective. You're not a Laurentian elite. You're not one of the typical Ottawa reporters that weighs in on politics. You're coming at this as a Westerner. And I'm curious what you saw and took away from the by-election results.
Well, for me, if I'm Chrystia Freeland and I'm Justin Trudeau, if I can concoct a writing, out of a petri dish, where hopefully this messaging coming out of April's budget, surrounding the budget itself, and in particular surrounding the capital gains inclusion rate changes coming out of the budget, where I would expect this rhetoric to have some sort of traction, that writing would look an awful lot like Toronto St. Paul's. So it's very middle of the road. You talk about Main Street. It doesn't get much more Main Street than Toronto St. Paul's. It's about median income by the standards of Ontario, about median income smack dab in the middle socioeconomically by the standards of Canada. So if there's anywhere where particularly Chrystia Freeland's messaging about a kinder, gentler Canada, having the rich pay their fair share, if there's anywhere where you would expect that sort of messaging to resonate, it would be a riding that looks an awful lot like Toronto St. Paul. And we did not see that. And to make matters even worse for the Liberals, they can't point the finger at the NDP. The NDP had a much worse showing yesterday than they did back in 2021, losing about 6 points. So you saw, pretty much a straight up race between, Poilievre's message and the Liberal message coming out of the budget, hitting some of those class warfare notes much stronger than had been in the case previously. And the Liberal message was found wanting, which if I'm Chrystia Freeland in particular, I wagered a lot of political capital on this by-election. I'm very concerned, and I'm thinking my days in the finance portfolio may be numbered.
Well, you raise a valid point. I mean, we saw all the last few days, every Liberal cabinet minister imaginable going and knocking on doors in St. Paul's. And, the cruel reckoning that they have to deal with here is maybe they were costing votes. Like maybe when Chrystia Freeland comes to your door and says, I want you to vote for Leslie Church, at this point you're like, oh, well, who's the other guy?
Yeah, and it's worth noting that Leslie Church, prior to getting into electoral politics, she was a senior staffer for Freeland for a long time, in the office of the Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, rising up to Freeland's Chief of Staff. So not only is Freeland front and center stumping for Church throughout the campaign, including those remarks she gave on Monday, calling Conservative voters, I think, cruel and small and mean, but also you had a close ally who actually didn't live in the riding, nominated to run in the riding, and not doing much to shed any sort of association with Chrystia Freeland. So, I mean, you have, in a way, a sort of double whammy for Freeland. And not only did her message fail, not only did her sort of personal appearances not seem to move the needle, at least in the direction she would have preferred, but also she had, a handpicked close ally run in the riding and failed to bring it home.
You were pointing out as well the Israel factor. And I mean, foreign policy is not typically an issue that moves votes in Canadian elections. It just isn't. And it's a lot different when you talk about Israel, which has diaspora implications that go beyond just Canadian foreign policy. And in a riding like St. Paul's, which has an incredibly robust Jewish population relative to other parts of the country. And I mean, I know you've seen on Twitter this, nonsensical theory that the Liberals lost because they were just too pro-Israel. Meanwhile, anyone else who's pro-Israel is looking and saying, well, first off, no, they're not. And secondly, being pro-Israel, if it's going to help you at all, will help you in St. Paul's. Because you point out, the Anthony Housefather issue. This is, the MP that almost quit the Liberals because of their hostility to him as a Jew. And he was then dispatched to try to get desperate votes for St. Paul's.
Yeah, so I mean, putting aside the war in Gaza, I don't think bullying is too strong of a word to characterize Housefather's treatment at the hands of some of his Muslim, colleagues in the Liberal caucus. One, a member of Parliament for Brampton saying, Housefather has been divisive, just for being staunchly pro-Israel and just for being a proud Zionist, and that Housefather is the wrong person to combat both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Canada. I don't think bullying is too strong a word. And I think putting aside the war in Gaza, that treatment of Housefather by his own colleagues and the Prime Minister not being the adult in the room and putting that sort of public criticism, that sort of speaking outside of school to rest and saying we're not going to tolerate personal attacks within our caucus against fellow caucus members. I think that could have been incredibly damaging within Toronto St. Paul, among, as you say, the 15% or so of voters in that riding who are Jewish. Actually, Robin Urbach of the Globe and Mail, of all outlets, had an article come out on Monday morning imploring Housefather to, out of self-respect, out of sort of his personal convictions, imploring Housefather to leave the Liberal caucus. So I think when you have not only a general environment in Canada of anti-Semitism, but also the Prime Minister not lifting a finger really to, one, control anti-Semitism in the streets, but not even lifting a finger to rein in anti-Semitism in his own caucus. A lot of people in that riding, Jewish voters, probably looked at that and were put off, and understandably so.
Yeah, very well said. Always appreciate reading your insights in the National Post. Rahim Mohamed, thank you so much, sir. Always good to talk to you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Rahim. By the way, I was just told, so Justin Trudeau did a press conference. He was doing an announcement on something to do with ocean conservation. Did not take any questions. Did not take any questions at all. He shut it down. No questions, no Q&A, bolted out of the room. Here we are thinking Chrystia Freeland was being stingy for only taking 3 questions. Or questions from 3 reporters. Justin Trudeau took 0. So almost as though he has really nothing to say. That does it for us for today. We'll have more on this tomorrow here on Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to the Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.